The morning Luke Barker rode into Redemption Valley, the land broker told him every parcel along the river had already sold, and then offered him 6 more that hadn't, all of them good, all of them green, all of them easy, and Luke turned every last one of them down without a second glance. The broker, a soft-handed man named Gerald Potts who wore his collar too tight and sweated through his vest even in mild weather, watched with genuine bewilderment as Luke stood at the edge of the valley and surveyed it with those pale gray eyes of his that never seemed to blink when he was thinking hard about something. The valley spread out below them like a gift from God, wide and golden in the early October light of 1882, threaded through with the silver ribbon of Coldwater Creek, and rimmed on all sides by low red hills that turned purple at dusk. It was the kind of country that made a man's chest ache with wanting. Gerald had sold 47 parcels in this valley over the past 3 years, and had never once had a buyer refuse the best ones. "You are absolutely certain?" Gerald asked, mopping his forehead with a handkerchief that had seen better days. "The Henderson tract alone is worth twice what I am asking. Good soil, good water, good elevation. I have had 3 other inquiries this month alone." "Then sell it to one of them," Luke said, his voice low and level as a carpenter's rule. "But the Dunmore parcel, the creek runs right through the middle of it. You could water 1,000 head without breaking a sweat." "No." Gerald pointed further down the valley, toward a gentle slope where a cluster of cottonwoods marked what every experienced rancher knew to be a perfect natural windbreak. "The Bellamy Acres. Mr. Barker, that land practically works itself." Luke finally turned and looked at the broker with an expression that was not unkind but was entirely final. "I want the southeast corner," he said. "The rocky bit where Coldwater Creek turns away from the property line." "The piece with the caliche flats." Gerald stared at him. "That is the worst land in the valley. I know what it is. The soil is barely worth breaking. The water table is low. Your nearest neighbor would be," Gerald consulted his ledger, flipping pages with a faint air of defeat, "Catherine Thatcher. Widow. Runs about 200 head on the adjacent parcel, which is no great shakes itself, I must say, though considerably better than the corner you are describing." Luke looked southeast, toward the rough edge of the valley where the red hills crowded in close, and the creek made its sharp bend away from the property line, as if wanting nothing to do with what lay beyond. A thin column of smoke rose from somewhere in that direction, probably a cook fire or a line cabin. Something in him settled when he saw that smoke, the way a compass needle settles when it finds north. "I will take it," he said. "Draw up the papers." Gerald Potts did draw up the papers, shaking his head the entire time, and Luke Barker rode southeast with a deed in his saddlebag and nothing else but a bedroll, a Winchester, a good horse named Calhoun, and 2 years' worth of plans he had never shared with a living soul. He was 28 years old and had spent the last 6 of those years working other men's land from Texas to Montana, learning everything there was to know about bad soil and what it took to make something from nothing. Before that had been the war's shadow, not the war itself, which had ended before Luke was old enough to fight, but the aftermath of it, which had been its own kind of violence. His family's farm in Missouri had not survived Reconstruction. His father had not survived the grief of losing it. His mother had taken his 2 younger sisters to live with relatives in Ohio, and had looked at Luke on the day she left with an expression that said, as plainly as words could have, that she was not sure whether she was relieved or sorry to be going. He had been 19 then. He had gone west rather than north, drawn by something he couldn't have named at the time but understood better now. He wanted land that nobody else wanted. He wanted to build something that couldn't be taken away by a banker or a tax collector or a shift in political fortune. He had learned enough in 6 years of punching cattle for other outfits to know that the best range in a given valley was always the first to be seized, the first to be fought over, the first to be lost when times went bad. But the rough corners, the caliche flats, the rocky ground that other men rode past without a second look, Those places had a way of outlasting everything. That was the theory anyway. He had yet to test it on his own ground. He made camp that first night on his new property, which announced its unworthiness in every possible way. The ground was hard enough that his picket stake bounced back at him twice before taking hold. The scrub brush was sparse and dry. There was no creek sound, no pleasant murmur of moving water to soften the dark, just the wind coming off the red hills and the distant coyotes and the smell of dust. Luke sat by his small fire and ate cold biscuits he had bought in the town of Redemption 8 miles back, and felt something he would not have called happiness exactly, but that was in the same family as it. He was on his own land. Whatever came next was his to make or break. He had been there a week sleeping in the open, marking out where the house would go, determining the exact depth at which water could be coaxed from the reluctant ground, when he first saw Catherine Thatcher. She came from the west, riding along the property line on a dark bay horse with a white blaze on its face, and she rode the way people ride when they have been doing it their whole lives and no longer have to think about it. She sat easy in the saddle, one hand resting on her thigh, and she was moving at a steady walk that suggested she was looking at something rather than going somewhere. She wore a plain brown riding skirt, a collarless shirt the color of old cream, and a hat that had clearly been her working hat for a long time. Her hair was dark brown, pinned up but losing the battle with the wind. She stopped when she saw him, not with alarm but with the frank assessment of a person who has learned that strangers on neighboring land are a fact of life worth investigating calmly. "You are the one who bought the southeast corner," she said. It was not precisely a question. "Luke Barker," he said, standing up from where he had been crouched over a survey stake and brushing the dust from his knees. She looked at him for a moment, then at the land around him, and he could see her taking note of the way he had marked his corners, the placement of the survey stakes, the cleared space where he intended to dig a foundation. She was reading what he had done the way a rancher reads a brand looking for what it told her about the animal. "Catherine Thatcher," she said, "my east fence line runs along your west boundary. We are going to be neighbors." "I know," he said. She looked at him again with those eyes that he would come to know as dark hazel, more gold than green in strong sunlight but shifting toward something deeper in the shade. "Gerald Potts told half the county you turned down the Henderson tract," she said. "And the Dunmore parcel, and the Bellamy acres. He talks a lot for a man who charges by the word." Something moved in her expression that was not quite a smile but was in the neighborhood of one. "Does," she agreed. "May I ask why you chose this corner?" Luke considered her for a moment. She asked directly and she waited for the answer without filling the silence with chatter, which told him something about her. "Because it is the hardest piece," he said, "and because hard things tend to last." She was quiet for a moment, looking out across his caliche flats where the afternoon light hit the pale ground and threw off a faint shimmer that in a more charitable country might have been mistaken for water. "That is an unusual way to think about land," she said. "Maybe," he said. "My husband thought the same way," she said, and something in her voice shifted just slightly, like a door opening onto a cooler room. "He chose this parcel over 3 better ones. He said the creek land would be fought over inside a decade, and he wanted something that would still be ours when the fighting was done." Was he right? He was right about the fighting, she said. He did not live to see whether he was right about the rest of it. There was nothing to say to that, so Luke didn't try to say anything, and Catherine Thatcher seemed to appreciate the restraint. She picked up her reins. "There is a spring about a quarter-mile inside your south boundary," she said. "It is not marked on the survey. My husband found it 3 years ago when he was fencing. It runs weak in August, but it does not go dry. You will want to know about it." She rode off before he could thank her. Luke found the spring the next morning. It was exactly where she had said it would be, a thin seep coming up through a crack in the caliche that spread into a small pool no bigger than a kitchen table, clear and cold and entirely invisible from more than 10 feet away. He stood beside it for a long time, thinking about the woman who had told him about it and the husband who had found it, and all the versions of this valley story he did not yet know. He began building the house in the second week of October. He could afford lumber for the main structure. He had saved carefully for 6 years, but he was doing most of the work himself, which meant it was slow and the days were long. He was up before first light and working until he could no longer see, and he was just beginning to feel the particular exhaustion of a man who has pushed himself past the point of reason, when a wagon appeared on the track that skirted his property line and stopped, and Catherine Thatcher climbed down from the seat with a covered pot in her hands. "I made too much stew," she said, in a tone that made it clear she did not expect him to challenge this statement. "My ranch hand Emmett is away visiting his sister, and I cannot eat a whole pot by myself." Luke had been eating hardtack and dried beef for 11 days. The smell coming from that pot was enough to make a man reconsider his entire philosophy of solitude. "I am much obliged," he said, and he meant it in a way that went beyond the stew, though he kept that part to himself. She stayed while he ate, not because it would have been proper for her to leave the pot and go, but because she sat on a fence rail and looked at the framing he had done and asked questions about it that were intelligent and specific. She knew about construction, not as a spectator, but as someone who had done it or watched it done closely enough to understand the choices involved. "You are setting your foundation stones deeper than most," she observed. "The caliche will heave in a hard freeze if you do not go below it," he said. She nodded slowly, like someone confirming a thing they had suspected. "My husband set ours at 18 inches, and we cracked a corner post our second winter. I had to reshore it last spring." "Did you do it yourself?" Emmett helped, but mostly yes. He looked at her over the rim of the tin cup he was using for the stew, and she met his gaze without any particular self-consciousness, as if the idea that a woman doing foundation repair was remarkable had simply never occurred to her. He found that he liked this about her very much. Her name was Catherine Ann Thatcher, née Hollies, and she was 26 years old. He learned this gradually, in the way you learn things about a neighbor in country where people are too spread out and too busy for formal introductions and long sit-down conversations. You learn it in pieces, in the course of doing things over a fence line, when one of her calves had pushed through onto his property, and they were both working to cut it back, over the sound of a hammer when she came to help him roof the house on a Saturday in late October because she had done it before, and he could use the extra hands, over a shared meal at her kitchen table when a November rainstorm stranded them both indoors for a long afternoon. He learned that she had come to the valley 3 years ago with her husband Thomas Thatcher, who had been a good man and a harder worker than his slight frame had suggested, and who had died of a fever in the summer of their second year before their small cattle operation was fully established. He learned that she had no family close enough to call on, that her parents were in Pennsylvania, and her one brother was in California, and that she had stayed not because she had nowhere to go, but because she had decided that leaving would mean the valley had beaten her, and she was not the kind of woman who could live with that. She had hired Emmett Grady, a lean and good-natured man of 45 with a gray beard and a comfortable way about him, and between the two of them they had kept the place going through one more year and were now, as she put it without any drama, not entirely losing money. He learned that she had an opinion about nearly everything, expressed without apology, and that she was almost always right, which was initially surprising and then, quickly, not surprising at all. He learned that she laughed at dry jokes the way some people laugh at loud ones, with her whole face, her eyes going bright, a laugh that was quick and genuine and over almost before it started. He learned that she was not lonely in any obvious way, but that there was a kind of solitude about her that went deeper than living alone, a quiet in her that might have been self-sufficiency or might have been grief or was probably both, knotted together in the way those things tend to be. He learned these things, and he stored them away in the same careful manner in which he approached every other aspect of his work, methodically, attentively, without rush. What he did not do for quite a long time was tell her how he felt. This was partly because he was not a man who moved quickly in any direction, having learned through long experience that the things you rushed into were the things you later had to spend enormous effort undoing. It was partly because she was a widow of barely a year and a half, and whatever he felt had no business putting pressure on grief that was still settling into its final shape. And it was partly because she was his neighbor, and his neighbor was, for the first time in his adult life, something he genuinely could not afford to lose. But feelings do not much care about reasons. They accumulate the way water does in low ground slowly, without apparent intention, and then one day you look and there is more of it than you realized. The winter of 1882 into 1883 was hard in Redemption Valley. Hard cold, hard wind, and a blizzard in January that came on fast and vicious and caught 3 of Catherine's calves out on the east pasture. Luke saw the weather turn from his window. He was in the house by then, solid if spare, the wood stove throwing good heat, and he pulled on his heaviest coat and rode out without having to think about it, because the east pasture abutted his fence line, and he had seen the calves there that morning. He found her already out there in the dark and the snow, riding with a lantern, and together they brought the calves in, which was cold, miserable work that took the better part of 3 hours and left them both covered in snow and thin ice and the particular mud that forms when cattle panic in wet conditions. When it was done and the calves were penned and alive, Catherine stood in her barn with her lantern casting long, warm shadows and looked at him with something in her expression that she did not quite have a name for yet either. "You did not have to come," she said. "I know," he said, which was the same thing she had said to him 2 months ago when she had come to help him roof his house, and they both recognized the echo of it and were quiet for a moment. "Come inside," she said. "I will make coffee." Her kitchen was warm and smelled of wood smoke and something sweet she had been baking earlier in the day, a dried apple cake that sat on the counter in a tin. She made coffee and cut 2 slices of the cake, and they sat at her kitchen table with their wet coats steaming on the chair backs and their boots leaving puddles on her plank floor, and they talked for a long time about nothing in particular. The storm, the price of cattle, the new family that had settled on the Dunmore parcel. Gerald had tried to sell Luke, a man named Aldrich who had already started fencing in a way that suggested he had grand ideas about expanding his boundary lines. "He has been pushing his fence post 6 inches east of the survey line," Catherine said, wrapping both hands around her coffee cup. "I measured it myself last week." 6 inches, Luke said. 6 inches this year," she said, looking at him with those hazel eyes over the rim of her cup. 12 next year if nobody says anything. I will say something. I can manage it. I have no doubt of that," he said, "but you should not have to manage it alone." She looked at him steadily and he looked back at her, and the kitchen was very quiet except for the stove and the wind pressing at the window glass, and something passed between them in that quiet that was too clear to be ignored and too large to be addressed without more courage than either of them had assembled yet. "Thank you," she said finally, "for the calves. Thank you for the apple cake," he said. He rode home through the dying blizzard and could not sleep for a long time, lying in his bunk with the stove ticking as the fire settled and thinking about the way she had looked at him over that coffee cup, and about the 6 inches of fence line, and about the spring on his south boundary that she had found for him and the stew she had brought when he was half-starved, and the way she had laughed, quickly and genuinely, when he had made a dry remark about Gerald Potts charging by the word. He thought about Thomas Thatcher too, a man he had never met, and about what it meant to honor the memory of someone you had no quarrel with and had in fact come to feel a complicated sort of gratitude toward, because whatever that man had been and done had made Catherine Thatcher the woman she was, and Luke could not find it in himself to wish for a world in which she was different. Spring came to the valley in early March of 1883, with the tentative quality of a guest who was not sure of their welcome. The snow went off the low hills first, and then the grass came back, and the creek ran full and noisy with melt water. And Luke's land, which everyone had agreed was the worst in the valley, did something that surprised Gerald Potts considerably when he came to check on what he clearly expected to be a failed venture. The Caliche Flats, which looked in summer like bleached bone, had proved to be underlaid with a deep layer of clay that held moisture far longer than the sandier soils on the better parcels. The grass that came up on Luke's land in March was still green in the first week of June, when most of the valley's pastures were beginning to brown at the edges. The spring on his south boundary, weak and overlooked and unmarked on any survey, ran clear all through the dry spell in late April when two of the creek-fed parcels to the north ran sluggish and warm. This was the first of his theories proved correct, that the hard land endured. He began building his herd that spring, buying carefully 20 head of good stock from a rancher east of town who was consolidating, a quality bull he had been looking for all winter, and 6 breeding heifers that he had negotiated hard for and gotten at a price that left him satisfied. Emmett Grady, Catherine's ranch hand, helped him trail the cattle from town on a day in late April when the sky was that particular blue that only exists in the high desert spring, and Catherine came along because she knew the trail and the terrain, and because Luke was beginning to understand. She had a way of inserting herself usefully into situations without anyone being quite sure when she had decided to do so. They were 3 days out and back, trailing slow with the cattle, camping each night beside the trail. The first night Emmett fell asleep almost immediately after supper in the way that only men who have worked outdoors all their lives can do, wholly and without ceremony. And Luke and Catherine sat by the fire for a long time without talking much, which was something they had gotten comfortable with over the winter, the particular ease of not needing to fill every silence. She was drawing in the dirt with a stick idle patterns that meant nothing, and he was watching the fire, and after a while she said, without looking up, "Emmett thinks you are good people." "Emmett is a generous judge of character," Luke said. "He is not actually," she said. "He has disliked almost everyone I have introduced him to. He disliked the Aldrich man immediately, which I thought was premature at the time, but which I now believe was entirely correct." Luke looked at her. "Has Aldrich moved his fence line again? 8 inches past the survey line now," she said. "His total encroachment is 14 inches. That is not nothing." "No," she said, "it is not." He thought about it for a moment. "Have you spoken to him directly?" 3 times, she said, and her voice was perfectly even, which somehow made the frustration underneath it more apparent rather than less. "The first time he apologized and said it was an accident. The second time he told me I must have measured wrong. The third time he asked me if I would not be better off selling and going back east to be near my family, because ranching is hard work for a woman alone." Luke felt a quiet heat move through him that he kept carefully off his face. "And what did you say to him?" She smiled, briefly and with some satisfaction. "I said that my family was in Pennsylvania and I had no interest in Pennsylvania, and that the survey stakes had been placed by a licensed surveyor and were not subject to my measuring wrong. And then I told him that if his fence line moved 1 more inch, I would be speaking to the county sheriff." "Good," Luke said. She looked at him sideways. "I thought you might offer to speak to him yourself." "I thought you might prefer to handle it yourself," he said. She was quiet for a moment. "I do prefer it," she said. "But it would be easier, I think, if he understood that I am not entirely alone." The word alone sat in the fire-lit air between them, not quite comfortable, not quite uncomfortable, like something that had been said slightly louder than intended. "You are not alone," Luke said, and he said it simply and directly and without any additional weight, though there was additional weight behind it, more than he was ready to put into words yet. She looked at him then fully, and he looked back at her, and the fire crackled between them and the night pressed in warm around them, and Emmett snored softly 20 feet away, and Catherine Thatcher held his gaze for 3 full seconds before she looked back down at the pattern she was drawing in the dirt. "No," she said quietly. I suppose I am not. The Aldrich situation came to a head in May in a way that nobody had entirely predicted. Jeb Aldrich was not a bad man exactly, but he was the kind of man who read every accommodation as an invitation to press further. And when Catherine and Luke both appeared at his fence line on a Tuesday morning, with a measuring rope and a calm, unified manner that made it clear neither of them was going anywhere until this was resolved. He went red in the face and loud in his language, and made some statements about what women ought to be doing with their time, and what newcomers to the valley ought to know about who had been there first, which was interesting because both statements were equally false. Catherine had been there longer than Aldrich, and Aldrich had arrived only 8 months. Before Luke said very little during this exchange. He stood beside Catherine, his thumbs in his belt, and let her do the talking, which she did with a precision and composure that he found quietly extraordinary. She laid out the survey numbers, the dates of the encroachments, the 3 previous conversations, and the intended next step, which was Sheriff Dan Holt in redemption, and she did it all in a voice that was as level and matter-of-fact as if she were discussing the weather. Aldrich turned to Luke at one point, in the way that men who are losing arguments sometimes pivot to address a different audience. "You going to just let a woman talk for you, Barker?" "She is speaking for herself," Luke said. "I'm here to confirm that everything she has said is accurate, and that I measured this fence line myself yesterday with the same result." Aldrich sputtered for a while longer and then went quiet, and then, 2 days later, moved his fence posts back to the correct line. He never apologized, and he was not warm to either of them afterward, but the fence stayed where it belonged for the remainder of the time he owned the property, and that was what mattered. Walking back from the fence line that morning, Catherine and Luke rode side by side in comfortable silence for a while, and then she said, "Thank you for coming." "I know you could have managed it," he said. "I could have," she agreed, "but having you there it was easier. The way having a good fence is easier than not having one. The fence might not change the weather, but you notice its absence when the storm comes." He looked at her profile, the set of her jaw, the way she was looking straight ahead at the trail, the line of her throat where the morning light caught it. "Is that what I am?" he asked. "A fence?" She turned to look at him, and there it was again, that thing in her eyes that had been accumulating all winter like water in low ground. "I do not know yet what you are," she said. "I am still working it out." "Take your time," he said. She took another 2 months, which did not feel like a long time to anyone watching, and felt like a considerable time to Luke, who spent those months doing what he had come to the valley to do, working his land, building his herd, digging a proper well with a hand-crank pump that was the envy of every rancher within 5 miles, and doing all of it with a persistent awareness of the woman on the adjacent property that lived in him, the way music lives in a person who has heard a particular song too many times to unhear it. He was at her fence line on a Wednesday evening in July, a warm, golden July evening with the air smelling of dry grass, and the first hint of the cooling that came after sunset replacing a post that had rotted out at its base, because he had noticed it leaning when he had ridden past that morning, and because it was close enough to his own line that if it went down it would tangle with his wire, which was a practical reason to fix it that he did not examine too closely. Catherine found him there when she came back from checking her south pasture, and she pulled her horse up and looked at him working and was quiet for a moment. "I was going to do that this week," she said. "I had the tools with me," he said, setting the new post and tamping the earth around it. She dismounted and came and stood beside him and held the post steady while he packed the last of the dirt in, and when it was done she did not step back. She was close enough that he could smell the clean outdoor smell of her sun and grass and leather, and when he straightened up he was looking straight at her, closer than they had stood since the night they had brought in the calves in January, and neither of them stepped back. "Luke," she said, and her voice was careful and her eyes were not. "Catherine," he said, with the same care and the same lack of it underneath. "I have been thinking," she said, "about the fence post. "Do not make me laugh right now," she said, though the corner of her mouth had moved. "I am trying to say something serious." "All right," he said. She took a breath. The evening light was on her face, warm and full, and her eyes were the color of the autumn creek in that light, gold and brown and green all at once. "I have been thinking that Thomas would have liked you," she said. "He would have respected what you are doing here and the way you went about it. And I have been thinking that I am very glad you chose the southeast corner, and that I hope you understand that what I am about to say has nothing to do with any practical concern whatsoever." "What are you about to say?" he asked, his voice very quiet. "That I think about you considerably more than is reasonable for a neighbor," she said, "and that I have been doing so since approximately the first week of November, and that it seems to me we have both been circling this thing long enough that one of us ought to simply say it plainly." Luke looked at her for a moment, and something in him that had been held carefully in check for a long time let go, the way a door lets go when you finally unlock it and the wind takes it. "I love you," he said. "I have been in love with you since January, more or less, and probably longer than I knew." She stared at him for 1 second, and then her face did the thing it did when she laughed, eyes going bright, everything opening up, but this time she did not laugh. She stepped forward and took hold of the front of his shirt with both hands and kissed him, which was not at all like the tentative and cautious approach to romance that the previous 8 months might have suggested either of them was capable of. It was direct and certain and warm, and it lasted long enough that his hat ended up somewhere on the ground, and her horse looked at them both with the supreme indifference of animals who have seen everything and find most of it unimpressive. When they broke apart, she kept her hands on his shirt and looked up at him with the particular expression of a woman who has made a decision she is completely confident in. "I love you too," she said. In case that was not evident. "It is now," he said, and kissed her again. They were not people who moved fast in any direction, but they were people who knew their own minds. And so the summer of 1883 moved forward with a clarity of purpose that suited them both. Luke came to her table for supper twice a week, and then 3 times, and then most nights. And she came to his land in the mornings, sometimes to ride the perimeter with him and look at his cattle, and talk about the things that needed to be planned for, and the things that had surprised them both about how the valley was developing. Emmett Grady, who had given Luke a long appraising look back in April and said nothing at all, now greeted him with the comfortable ease of a man who has been confirmed in his assessment and feels no need to make anything of it. The town of Redemption had opinions, as small towns in the West always did. Gerald Potts told anyone who would listen that he had suspected all along that Luke had chosen the southeast corner because Catherine Thatcher's land adjoined it, which was not true, but was the kind of story that improved with telling and could not be disproven. The minister's wife, a sharp-eyed woman named Mrs. Everhart, told Catherine directly over the counter at the dry goods store that she thought it was wonderful that she was not letting grief stop her from living, and Catherine thanked her with a graciousness that did not quite conceal the fact that she found the remark somewhat presumptuous. Sheriff Dan Holt, who was a broad and quiet man of 50 who had seen enough in his 20 years in Redemption to have opinions about very little, simply nodded at Luke one afternoon and said, "Good woman, that one," in a tone that settled the matter. There was a dance in Redemption in late August, a summer social held in the open lot behind the livery, with a fiddle player from out of county and paper lanterns strung between posts, and most of the valley's scattered population, making the long ride in because summer socials were the kind of event that made the isolation of ranch life bearable by periodically ending it. Luke had not danced since he was a boy in Missouri at his cousin's wedding, and he told Catherine this as they stood at the edge of the dancing with tin cups of lemonade and watched Emmett Grady spinning a widow from the north end of the valley with surprising skill. "I do not dance well," he said. "How badly?" she asked. "Badly enough that my dance partners have generally preferred to sit down." She looked at him sideways. "I have not sat down voluntarily in some time," she said. I will take my chances." She did not regret it, or at least she did not say so, though he stepped on her foot twice in the first song and managed to turn the wrong direction at a moment that sent them briefly into another couple. She laughed both times, the real laugh, full and quick, and kept her hand in his and her eyes on his face. And by the second song he had found something like his footing, and by the third he was holding her closer than was strictly necessary for the figures of the dance, and she was not objecting to this. They danced 4 songs and then sat down because her foot was probably bruised, though she would not admit it, and then they sat for a long time in the warm August dark with the music going, and the lanterns swaying in the light wind, and the stars over the valley enormous and close the way they only are in high desert country. And he told her about Missouri, and about what had happened to his family's land, and why he had come west, and why he had chosen the worst land in the valley. And she listened with the particular quality of attention she had that made you feel that the thing you were saying was not only being heard, but being understood at a level deeper than the words. And then she told him things she had not told many people about Thomas, about the year of his illness and the summer of his death, about the winter after when she had run the ranch on nothing but stubbornness and Emmett's loyalty, and a conviction that giving up would mean she had let something precious be wasted. She told it without drama and without any bid for sympathy, and he listened the same way she had listened to him, taking it in fully, holding it with the care it deserved. "You have built something remarkable here," he said when she had finished. "Both of you did, and then you held on to it alone." "Not alone," she said, glancing toward Emmett, who was now on his 3rd dance with the widow from the North End. "No," Luke agreed. "Not entirely." She took his hand there in the dark at the edge of the party, and he folded his fingers around hers, and they sat like that for a long time while the fiddle played and the lanterns swayed and Redemption Valley's scattered population danced in the summer dark. He asked her to marry him in September, which was perhaps faster than the preceding 8 months of careful restraint might have suggested, but felt to both of them like exactly the right pace, not hurried but not timid, which was more or less the way they operated in everything else. He did it at the spring on his south boundary on a Sunday afternoon, the one she had told him about on their very first meeting, the small secret spring that came up through the caliche and spread into a pool no bigger than a kitchen table and was clear and cold and permanent. He had brought her there on the pretext of showing her the improvement he had made, a simple stone-lined basin that kept the seep clean and deep. And when she had admired it and was standing beside the water with the September light all around her, he said, without any particular preamble, "I want to marry you, Catherine, if you will have me." She turned and looked at him, and he was looking back at her with the same steady, unblinking quality he had when he was thinking hard about something, except that this was not thinking. This was already decided. "The land," she said, because she was a practical woman and some part of her always wanted to understand the logistics of a situation, even the emotional ones. "My deed and yours held together, any arrangement you choose," he said. "The Thatcher name on the ranch if you want it. Whatever you feel is right." "I am not worried about the name," she said. "What are you worried about?" She was quiet for a moment, looking at him, and the water moved gently at their feet. "Nothing," she said. "I am not worried about anything." "Then yes." "Yes," she said. "Of course yes." They were married in October of 1883 at the small church in Redemption, which was barely large enough to hold the people who came, including Gerald Potts, who cried with a sentimentality that surprised everyone including himself, and Emmett Grady, who wore his best shirt and stood with the solemnity of a man attending an event of great personal significance. Sheriff Holt came and shook Luke's hand with the manner of someone awarding a commendation. Mrs. Everhart said something about it being a beautiful occasion, and was for once entirely right. Catherine wore a dress of dark blue wool that she had made herself with material ordered from the catalog, and she had her hair down, which Luke had never seen before, dark and long, and threaded with the first few strands of something the light made look almost red. He thought that he had never seen anything as beautiful as she was standing in that small church in the October light, with the valley showing through the window behind her and her eyes finding his across the space between them. He said his vows in a clear, level voice, and she said hers in the same way, and neither of them looked away from the other once. After the ceremony, they had supper at the hotel in Redemption. All of them. The neighbors and the sheriff and Emmett and Gerald and Mrs. Everhart, and the fiddle player from the August dance who had somehow been included. And there was considerable food and considerable talk, and Luke made a dry remark about Gerald's habit of selling land, and Gerald laughed so hard he spilled his coffee. And Catherine caught Luke's eye across the table, and the look she gave him was so warm and so entirely without reservation that he had to look away for a moment, because there are some things that are too much to receive all at once. They went home to the ranch, her ranch, his ranch, their ranch, and it was late and the valley was dark and cold with the particular cold of October nights, and the stars were out in their thousands overhead, and Calhoun, his horse, nickered at them from the paddock in a way that suggested mild offense at being left behind for the day. "We need to think about expanding the house," Catherine said, standing in the yard and looking at the sky. She said it in a practical tone, but he knew her well enough now to hear the larger thing inside it. "We do," he agreed. "There is a good floor plan in the catalog I ordered last spring," she said. 2 additional rooms off the main structure. Emmett and his nephew could help with the framing. "That would work," he said. She looked at him then in the dark and the cold and smiled, not the quick, bright, laugh-adjacent smile of their early acquaintance, but the other one, the slower and deeper one he had begun to see more of as the year had progressed, the one that reached all the way to her eyes and stayed there. "Luke," she said. "Catherine," he said, "I am very glad you chose the worst piece of land in the valley." He looked at her, this woman who had told him about the spring and brought him stew and helped him roof his house and laughed at his bad dancing and built something remarkable from grief and stubbornness, and who had, against what he would have considered reasonable expectation back when he first rode into this valley, become the thing he had not known he was building toward. "So am I," he said. He took her hand and they went inside. The house expansion was framed and roofed by the end of November. Emmett and his nephew working with Luke and Catherine over 3 long weekends while the weather held. And by Christmas of 1883 it was tight and warm and proportioned in the way that houses are when the people who build them intend to live in them for a long time. The winter of 1883 into 1884 was considerably gentler than the previous years, and Luke used the relative ease of it to address something that had been on his mind since spring, the question of water, which was the central question for any rancher in that country, and the one on which the long-term viability of everything depended. He had the well, which was good, and the spring, which was reliable but small, but the real asset, he had come to believe, was the clay layer under the caliche flats that held moisture so effectively through the summer. He spent 2 months over the winter studying it, riding the full extent of his land in different conditions, digging test pits, talking to a fellow in Redemption who had come west from Pennsylvania as a young man, and had brought with him a knowledge of basic hydrology that was mostly theoretical but proved useful. What he concluded, by February of 1884, was that the southeast corner of Redemption Valley was not the worst land in the valley. It was the most misunderstood land in the valley, which was a different thing entirely. He shared this conclusion with Catherine over their kitchen table on a cold February night, with the stove going and the coffee hot, and the ranch asleep around them, showing her the notes he had made and the rough diagrams of the clay layer and its extent. She sat across from him with her elbows on the table and her chin in her hands, reading his notes with complete attention, and when she was done, she looked up at him. "You came here knowing this," she said. "I came here believing it," he said. "I did not know it until this winter. Is it possible to expand it? To use the clay layer intentionally, to direct water from the spring through it, hold it over a larger area?" He looked at her. "That is exactly what I have been thinking about. How would you do it? Shallow channels, he said. Cut it grade to spread the water from the spring across the west flat before the dry season. The clay would hold it. The grass would stay green through August, maybe September. She was already looking at the diagram. If you cut the channels along the north edge as well, the runoff from my south pasture could feed into it during the rainy season, she said. Our properties share that drainage line. He had been thinking the same thing but had not wanted to presume about her land. He looked at her with the particular quality of feeling that her mind always produced in him, not surprise exactly, because he had long since stopped being surprised by her intelligence, but something warmer, the pleasure of being fully understood. Our properties, he said. She looked up at him and the corner of her mouth moved. Our properties, she agreed, with the equanimity of a woman who has been saying that word in various contexts for 4 months and has found it a good word. The irrigation project was built that spring and the spring of the following year. The channels cut gradually with the help of Emmett and his nephew, and a second ranch hand they hired in 1884. A young man named Abel who had come up the trail from Texas, and who turned out to have a gift for exactly this kind of earthwork that Luke had not anticipated when he hired him. The system was simple and unambitious, by the standards of the large irrigation projects being built elsewhere in the West. But it was theirs, and it worked, and by the summer of 1884 the West Flat was green in August for the first time in recorded memory, which made several neighbors ride over to look at it with the expression of people witnessing something mildly miraculous. Gerald Potts came out in September with a prospective buyer for the adjacent property, not Aldrich's, which remained, but a parcel to the north, and stood at the fence line and looked at Luke's green August pasture with the measured face of a man who is doing the arithmetic and not entirely enjoying the result. You told me this was the worst land in the valley, Luke said pleasantly. Gerald cleared his throat. I said that, yes. You were not entirely wrong, Luke said. 6 months ago. Gerald looked at the green grass and then at Luke and then back at the grass. I see that I was not working with complete information, he said. Most people are not, Luke said. Catherine, who had ridden up quietly on the bay horse with the white blaze, which was now 15 years old and moving more slowly but no less elegantly, said from behind them, Gerald, is that Mr. Pierce you have brought to look at the north parcel? Do send him over for supper later. We would like to meet our potential neighbors. Gerald turned, startled, and the prospective buyer, a thin, pleasant-looking young man, said that he would very much like that, and Gerald said he supposed that would be fine, and the prospective buyer did come for supper that evening, and turned out to be a recently married man whose young wife had come west from Ohio, with the practical determination of someone who has decided to make the best of a situation, and is quietly very good at it. And they were exactly the kind of neighbors that make a valley feel less like a collection of competing claims and more like a community. Their name was Henry and Ada Pierce, and they became, over the following years, what good neighbors in isolated country become, not intimate friends in the way that city people think of friendship, but something more dependably useful, and in some ways more meaningful than that. The people you could count on when the weather turned or the cattle strayed or the roof needed 3 pairs of hands more than it had. In the autumn of 1884, Catherine told Luke she was expecting a child. She told him at the spring, which had become the place where they went when they had something important to say, not by design, but simply by the gravity of the place and the associations it had accumulated. The light was the same October light as the year before when he had proposed, golden and full, and the water moved in the small stone basin, and she stood beside it and looked at him with the serious, bright quality she got when she was managing something significant. He stood very still for a moment, taking it in. Then he crossed the space between them and held her, carefully, as if she were something that had just become more precious by a degree he was still calculating, which was more or less accurate. Are you well? He asked against her hair. Very well, she said. I saw the doctor in Redemption yesterday. He says April. April came with cold and mud and the particular chaos of calving season, and their son came on the 14th of that month, loud and red-faced and present in the way that all new things are before they learn to be subtle about it. They named him James, Thomas Barker James for Luke's father and Thomas for Catherine's first husband, which she had suggested, and he had agreed to without hesitation, because it seemed right, and because the kind of love that lasts is never diminished by making room for the love that came before it. James Thomas was a large, healthy, extremely opinionated baby who demonstrated from his earliest weeks an interest in everything that moved, and a profound indifference to sleeping at the hours generally deemed appropriate for sleeping. Catherine managed him with the same combination of affection and brisk practicality with which she managed everything. And Luke, who had expected fatherhood to be a foreign country, found that he took to it with a naturalness that surprised him and moved him in equal measure. The ranch grew. Not quickly, not in the dramatic fashion of the large cattle operations that were gobbling up range land across the territory, but steadily and sensibly, the way things grow when the people tending them understand what they are doing and are not in a hurry to be done. By 1886, they had doubled the herd to 400 head and added another ranch hand. By 1887, the irrigation channels had been extended to cover the full extent of the West Flat, and were beginning to show the effect on the soil that Luke had theorized, the caliche gradually breaking down, the clay becoming more workable, the grass thicker and more varied in species. The valley around them changed too, sometimes in ways they approved of and sometimes not. The land rush that had been building through the early 80s brought more settlers, which meant more fences and more water disputes, and more of the friction that comes when people are trying to establish what is theirs in country that had, for a very long time, not been anyone's in the legal sense that newly arrived people were determined to impose on it. Luke and Catherine were not naive about this. The land they had bought and built on had been, not many years before, the territory of the Jicarilla Apache, who had known the valley springs and clay layers and drainage patterns considerably longer and more intimately than any settler, and whose removal from this country had been accomplished through a combination of federal force and treaty violation that did not bear close examination. When a small group of Jicarilla men came through the valley in the fall of 1885, moving quietly along the old trails that ran through the low hills, Luke left food and water at the spring and said nothing about it to anyone in town, and Catherine, who had seen him do it, looked at him for a long moment and then nodded once slowly. "This is their valley too," she said. "It was their valley first," he said. These were small gestures against a large wrong, and they knew it. But they made them anyway, because the alternative was to pretend that the ground they stood on had no history before their own, and neither of them was capable of that particular pretense. James Thomas turned 3 in April of 1888 and showed every indication of becoming a person who would need a great deal of space, both physically and metaphorically. He was large for his age and moved with a certainty that Luke recognized as inherited, and Catherine recognized as also inherited. And he had dark hair and pale gray eyes that were so precisely Luke's eyes, and a small face that strangers sometimes stopped and stared, which embarrassed Luke and made Catherine quietly pleased in a way she did not always try to conceal. In the summer of 1888, on a warm June evening that was the twin of 100 previous warm June evenings, Luke and Catherine sat on the porch of the expanded house and watched James Thomas chase a determined way across the yard after a barn cat that had decided not to be caught. And the valley was spread out before them in the long golden light, and the creek sound was audible on the quiet air, and the cattle were dark shapes on the green West Flat. "The Pierce family is going to increase," Catherine said. Luke looked at her. "Ada, she told me yesterday when I stopped in. She is due in November. They must be glad." "They are terrified and glad in the way people are," Catherine said, smiling. Henry wants to buy the half section to the north if it comes available. He spoke to Gerald about it. Gerald will manage to make something of that, Luke said. Gerald always manages to make something of everything, Catherine said, with the fond exasperation she reserved for people she found mildly ridiculous and genuinely liked. She was quiet for a moment, watching James Thomas give up on the barn cat and redirect his energy toward a stick on the ground, which was apparently equally interesting. "I spoke to the doctor in town on Monday," she said. He turned to look at her. "He says March," she said. He looked at her in the long June light, this woman who had been his neighbor and then his friend and then his love and then his wife, and was now, in every way that mattered, the center around which everything in his life organized itself, and felt the same thing he had felt 4 years ago at the spring when she told him about James Thomas, that the word enough did not apply here, that this kind of abundance did not reach a ceiling. He reached over and took her hand. "March," he said. "Yes," she said. She was right, as she generally was about the important things. The second child came in March of 1889. A girl this time, small and fierce and dark-eyed in a way that suggested she had made her own decision about arriving in the world and was prepared to defend it. They named her Rose Ellen, for Luke's mother's mother, and she was from her first days a person of strong preferences who made those preferences known with impressive directness, which Catherine said must come from Luke's side of the family, and which Luke said bore a striking resemblance to a quality he had observed in her mother, and they were both right. James Thomas, who was now 4, regarded his new sister with the watchful seriousness of a child who is not entirely sure about a development, but has decided to reserve judgment. By the time Ellen was old enough to follow him around the yard, he had reached his verdict, which was enthusiastic enough that Catherine began to spend a significant portion of her day ensuring that whatever James Thomas had decided to introduce his sister to was not immediately dangerous, which was a full-time occupation. The years passed with the quality that the good years in a life tend to have, not uneventfully, because no life in that country at that time was uneventful, but with a richness and a groundedness that made even the difficult things bearable and the good things extraordinary. Emmett Grady retired from active ranch work in 1890, his joints finally persuading him to concede what his determination had resisted for years, and settled into a role as the ranch's de facto grandfather, which involved considerable supervision of James Thomas and Rose Ellen, and only slightly less work than his previous position, since children require more management than cattle in most weather conditions. He was happy, and he knew he was happy, which is rarer than it should be. Abel, the ranch hand Luke had hired in 1884 for his earthwork skills, had grown into a capable and reliable man who could manage the operation through a season without instruction, which had become important as Luke spent more of his time on the water system that had become something of a calling, not just on his own land, but in consultation with neighbors who were struggling with the same dry season problems he had solved. He wrote letters, which he was not naturally inclined toward, to the Territorial Agricultural Office describing his methods, and received letters back from men in similar situations in other valleys, and had a visit in 1891 from a university man from Albuquerque who spent 3 days on the property taking notes and looking at everything and asked questions that were occasionally brilliant and occasionally so impractical they made Luke and Catherine exchange private glances. "He is going to write a paper," Catherine said, after the university man had ridden off with his notebook. "I know," Luke said. "It will be right," she said. "What you have done here is worth writing about." "What we have done," he said. She looked at him with the slow, deep smile that he had been the recipient of for 8 years now, and that still, without any diminishment, had the same effect on him it had had the first time he fully saw it, standing at the spring in the September light of 1883. "What we have done," she agreed. The paper was written and published in a territorial agricultural journal in 1892, and while it reached a modest audience, it reached the right ones, ranchers in the dry country of New Mexico and Arizona who were dealing with the same problems, and who read it with the attention of people who recognize something useful when they see it. Luke received letters about it for 3 years and answered all of them, and this small correspondence was a source of quiet satisfaction to him in the way that almost nothing else was except the land itself and the woman he had built it with. In the spring of 1893, Gerald Potts retired from land brokering, which he announced with more ceremony than anyone had expected, renting the hotel dining room for the occasion and giving a speech that was more sentimental than his professional reputation had prepared people for. He said several things that were gracious and a few that were inadvertently funny, and at one point he looked directly at Luke and Catherine and said, with complete sincerity, "I would like it on the record that when a man refused every good piece of land in this valley and chose the worst corner, I tried to talk him out of it, and I was wrong to try. And I hope he knew what he was doing because the result has been rather better than my best properties." There was laughter and Luke raised his cup to Gerald, and Catherine smiled, and the long story of the valley's settlement arrived at one of its small ceremonial moments of accounting. The children grew, in the way that children do when they are raised with enough space and enough love and enough work to give them proportion, not without difficulty, not without the particular frictions that arise between strong personalities in close quarters, but with a fundamental solidity that was visible in them from early on. James Thomas, at 10, was already a rancher in the practical sense. He could read a pasture, manage a small herd of cattle, and explain the basic principles of the irrigation system with an accuracy that reflected both observation and genuine understanding. He was quiet in the way his father was quiet, and direct in the way his mother was direct, and he had the combination of patience and determination that does well in country where most things take longer than expected. Rose Ellen, at 8, was, and there was no other word, formidable. She had decided that she wanted to know how everything worked, which meant she spent a significant portion of her time taking things apart to examine them, and an equal portion being assisted by Emmett in putting them back together. She was the one who noticed, at age 7, that the east channel of the irrigation system had a grade problem that was causing it to back up in the wet season, and who explained this to her father with a diagram she had drawn herself, which was largely accurate. Luke had looked at the diagram and then at his daughter for a long time before saying, quietly, "You are right," and going to fix it. On the evening of their 10th wedding anniversary, in October of 1893, Luke and Catherine rode out to the spring on the south boundary after supper, while Emmett sat with the children, and the October moon came up over the red hills and turned the Caliche Flats silver. The stone basin Luke had built 9 years ago was solid and deep, and the water came up through it clear and cold as it always had. They stood beside it in the moonlight and did not need to say very much because 10 years of a life together had given them a language that existed largely in the quality of silence, in the way two people who have worked and grieved and laughed and built in close proximity develop, and understanding that language is the small part of what passes between them. "I want to know what you think of," Catherine said after a while, "when you come here." He considered the question with the seriousness she had learned to expect from him when she asked something real. "The day you told me about it," he said. "The first day, you rode along the fence line and told me about a spring that was on my own land that I had not found yet. I think about that every time." She was quiet for a moment. "I think about the stew," she said, and he looked at her and she was smiling. "The first time I brought it over, I had made too much stew, and that was true, but I had also made it deliberately, and I had been thinking about an excuse to bring it for a week." He had not known that. He looked at her in the moonlight. "A week, 8 days," she said. "I was counting." He laughed, which was not the most dignified response but was entirely genuine, and she laughed too, the quick, full laugh he had loved since the first time he heard it, and the sound of it went out into the moonlit valley and was absorbed by the night. He took her hand and they stood there a while longer, beside the spring that she had found for him before they knew each other, on the worst land in the valley that had turned out to be none of those things, in the country they had built their life in together, year by patient year. And the creek sound was distant, and the cattle were quiet, and somewhere in the house their children were arguing about something important, audible even from this distance. And the night was cool and clear and enormous and entirely their own. 10 years, he said. 10 years, she said. Catherine, he said. She looked at him in the way she always looked at him when he said her name in that particular tone, fully, without reservation, the hazel eyes finding his in the dark. I would choose this land again, he said. The worst piece, the caliche flats, the low water table, all of it. She squeezed his hand. I know, she said. And I would choose the woman next door, he said. Every time. She did not say anything for a moment, and he felt her fingers tighten in his. And when she turned to look at him, her face had the expression that he had never been able to describe and had never needed to. The one that was not one single thing but all things at once. That held 10 years of shared mornings and hard winters and cattle drives and building seasons and arguments about fence lines and children named in love and dances where he stepped on her feet and 1,000 meals at a kitchen table and every small and large and ordinary and extraordinary moment of the life they had made. I know, she said again, very softly. I would choose the worst land too, every time. The moon climbed the sky above the red hills, and the spring moved in its stone basin and the valley lay around them, the full length of it, from the good creek-fed parcels in the northwest to the rough southeast corner, where the caliche caught the silver light, and it was all, in the end, equally theirs and equally worth having. In the years that followed, the ranch went on being built and improved and argued over and celebrated, and Emmett Grady went on supervising the children and the barn cat and everything else until he was old enough to be supervised himself, and Abel became a partner of sorts in the water system work, which had expanded to include 2 neighboring ranches and was now, by common acknowledgement in the valley, the reason that the southeast corner and its adjacent lands had not suffered in the drought years of the early 1890s, the way the creek-fed parcels had. James Thomas brought home a girl in 1900 when he was 15, who was the daughter of Henry and Ada Pierce, which struck absolutely no one as surprising, and Catherine and Ada Pierce sat on the porch of the ranch house together that afternoon and watched their children walk across the yard, and said nothing at all for a long moment, and then both started laughing at the same time. Rose Ellen, at 13, declared that she intended to be an engineer, which was not a thing that women did in 1898 but was, as anyone who knew Rose Ellen could have confirmed, the kind of thing she would find a way to do regardless. And Luke looked at Catherine and Catherine looked at Luke, and they had one of their wordless conversations, the language of 25 years of partnership, and what passed between them was, in essence, of course she will. The house, which Luke had built in October of 1882 as a single-room structure on foundations set deeper than most people thought necessary, had by 1900 become a substantial structure of 6 rooms with a long porch that faced west across the green pastures of the old Caliche Flats. And in the late afternoon the light came across it in a way that even Gerald Potts, had he been alive to see it, would have had to admit was beautiful. On a September evening in 1901, 19 years after Luke Barker had ridden into Redemption Valley and turned down every good piece of land in it, he sat on that porch with his wife of 18 years and watched the light move across the pasture and listened to the sounds of the ranch settling into the long quiet of evening. The cattle, the horses, Rose Ellen somewhere in the barn doing something mechanical. James Thomas and the Pierce girl on the porch of the line cabin visible at the property's eastern edge, 2 small figures in the late gold light. Gerald Potts would be very annoyed, Catherine said. Luke looked at her. She was watching the pasture with those hazel eyes, gold and green and brown in the September light, and she was 45 years old and the most beautiful thing in this valley or any other, and she knew it the way she knew most things, not with vanity but with a simple and complete accuracy. Gerald was a good man, Luke said. He would have come around. He did come around, Catherine said. He said so at his retirement party. He did, Luke agreed. She was quiet for a moment. Then, with the satisfied quality of a woman who has been proven right about something she cared deeply about. The worst land in the valley, she said. The best life in it, he said. She turned to look at him, and he looked back at her, and the evening light moved across the green pasture where the caliche had been, and the spring ran in its stone basin on the south boundary, and the valley held them in its red and golden hills, and everything that had been built here. Not just the fences and the channels and the house on its deep foundations, but the whole of it. The years and the seasons and the love that had grown as the best things do, from unlikely ground, through patience and care, into something that neither time nor weather nor any of the valley's harder seasons had found a way to diminish lay around them in the long September evening like land that is finally, fully, and entirely home.